For 100 years, they were nightmares made flesh horsemen born from the endless steppe, carrying fire, terror, and the silence of extinction wherever their hooves struck the earth. They called themselves the children of the eternal blue sky, but the world called them something else: the Mongols, the scourge of God, the riders who shattered kingdoms as if they were sandcastles on the edge of a storm. From the frozen tundra of the north to the marble palaces of Baghdad, their name carried the weight of apocalypse. Yet, history would find its cruel balance, for even the fiercest empire forged in blood must one day drown in it. The story begins not in Europe, but in the heart of the Mongolian steppe, where endless grass met the horizon like the skin of some sleeping giant. It was here that Temujin, the man the world would know as Genghis Khan, forged unity from chaos, transforming feuding tribes into a war machine. His warriors rode for days without rest, drinking the blood of their horses to survive, and killing without hesitation. When they first appeared on Europe's horizon, kings dismissed them as wild raiders. They were wrong. What came instead was annihilation, dressed in silence and discipline. In 1241, the Mongol horde descended upon Eastern Europe like a storm of iron and dust. Bato Khan, grandson of Genghis, led them. Behind him rode Subutai, perhaps the greatest military genius the medieval world ever faced. In less than 2 years, the Mongols crushed Poland, Hungary, and much of the Balkans. Cities burned, churches crumbled, and villages vanished from maps. European chroniclers wrote that the sky turned red for days, and that the ground itself trembled under the thunder of hooves. Everywhere they went, the same pattern followed: reconnaissance, deception, encirclement, annihilation. At Legnica, the combined forces of knights and crusaders fell like wheat before the scythe. At Mohi, the Hungarian army was trapped between river and fire, slaughtered almost to the last man. Survivors whispered that no mortal army could defeat such beings, that perhaps they were demons sent by God to punish Christian sin. But even the Mongols were bound by mortality. In 1242, as they prepared to march deeper into Europe, perhaps toward Vienna, perhaps to the Atlantic, word reached them that the great Khan Gadai was dead. The generals, bound by tradition, turned their horses eastward to elect a new ruler. And just like that, the storm lifted. Europe, bleeding and terrified, was spared, not by strength, but by death. For decades after, Europeans lived in dread of their return. Watchtowers were built along rivers, scouts patrolled borders, and prayers filled the cathedrals. The Mongols had proven that no wall, no castle, no army could stand before their precision. Yet, the same silence that had brought them power began to work against them. The great Khanate fractured. Karakorum, once the beating heart of empire, grew still. By the time Kublai Khan sat on the throne in the east, the Mongols had divided into rival realms: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Each branch looked upon the others with suspicion. Distance and arrogance eroded unity. Europe, meanwhile, began to change. The very lands once trampled by Mongol hooves began to sharpen their swords again. Across the plains of Rus, the people who had once bowed to Mongol overlords began to grow restless. Tribute had been paid for generations: silver, furs, slaves. But behind those payments simmered hatred. The princes of Moscow, especially Ivan I.M., Dmitry Donskoy, slowly gathered power, using Mongol permission and Mongol taxes to build armies of their own. It was the cruel irony of history. The Mongols had given their enemies the tools to rise. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, kingdoms had begun to solidify. France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire had survived their own civil wars and crusades. Knights who once fought each other now studied the Mongol campaigns, learning from their speed and discipline. The invention of plate armor, the longbow, and early gunpowder weapons shifted the balance of warfare. Slowly, methodically, Europe was preparing for a reckoning. But before the Mongols would fall, their arrogance would lead them into their own darkness. By the 14th century, the Golden Horde, once the terror of Europe, was rotting from within. The endless wealth flowing from tribute bred decadence. Khans drowned in luxury and intrigue. Succession wars shattered stability. The once mighty network of communication and control that connected Mongolia to the Danube collapsed into petty feuds. As Islam spread among the horde's elites, they began to clash with their Christian subjects. Faith became a fault line, dividing allies who once fought together. At the same time, the Black Death swept across Eurasia, killing millions. Trade routes that once carried silk and silver now carried death. The Mongols, who had prided themselves on their control of these arteries of commerce, watched as the very roads they had built turned into paths of plague. Cities under their protection fell silent. Populations vanished. The invincible riders of the steppe found themselves facing an enemy they could not outrun. By the time the plague faded, their empire was a skeleton. And on its western frontier, a new power had begun to stir, a power born from centuries of suffering under Mongol rule: the Russians. But Europe's vengeance would not come all at once. It would come slowly, brutally, like winter creeping over the grasslands. And when it did, the once invincible empire of the horsemen would vanish into legend. For a century, the Mongols had been the masters of half the known world. Their horses had drunk from the Danube, Their banners had cast shadows on the gates of Krakow and Vienna. But time is the one enemy that even conquerors cannot defeat. The Golden Horde, the last breath of Genghis Khan's empire, had grown soft. The riders who once lived by the bow and the sword now governed from palaces. They had forgotten the taste of hunger, the sound of wind against armor, the sacred simplicity of the saddle. Meanwhile, the lands they had once ruled through fear were changing. In the forests and frozen rivers of the north, the Russians were no longer trembling subjects, they were sharpening their blades. The city of Moscow, once a tributary outpost under Mongol rule, had learned the language of power. Its princes had paid their silver, bowed to the Khans, and waited. They had watched how the Mongols ruled, how they taxed, how they gathered strength, and then they used those same lessons against them. The transformation began under Ivan I of Moscow, who cleverly played rival Mongol factions against each other. He bought loyalty with tribute and titles, earning the Khan's trust while quietly consolidating his own rule. The Mongols thought him loyal. He was patient. His descendants would be anything but. By the time Dmitry Donskoy rose to power in the late 14th century, the Golden Horde was collapsing into civil war. Rival Khans claimed the throne. Armies fought brother against brother, and the once terrifying coordination of Mongol warfare dissolved into chaos. Dmitry saw his chance. For the first time in 2 centuries, the Russians would raise their swords not for tribute, but for freedom. In 1380, the two forces met at the Battle of Kulikovo, on the broad plain between the Don and Dnieper rivers. The Mongols still rode with their ancient ferocity, swift, disciplined, deadly. Their general Mamaye was not of Genghis's line but of his tradition, a master of mobility and deception. Yet the Russians had something new: unity and faith. Priests rode among their ranks, carrying icons, whispering prayers over trembling men. Before the battle began, Dmitry knelt before his army and declared that if they fell that day, they would fall as free men. When the horns of war sounded, the sky itself seemed to darken. The Mongols struck first, their arrows screaming through the air like locusts. Russian lines buckled, broke, then reformed. The earth became a swamp of blood and trampled grass. By afternoon, the horde began to falter. Their discipline, once flawless, cracked. When Dmitry's hidden reserve charged from the forest, the steppe warriors finally wavered. The horde was broken, and Mamaye fled. For the first time in living memory, the Invincible had been defeated. News of Kulikovo spread across Europe like wildfire. Chroniclers called it a miracle, proof that the Mongols were not divine, not immortal, merely men. But victory did not bring peace. Within 2 years, another Khan, Toktamish, returned with vengeance, burning Moscow to ashes. The Mongols reminded the Russians that freedom, like empire, was never permanent. Still, the seed had been planted. As the decades turned, the Golden Horde continued to decay. The once vast network that connected the Volga to the Black Sea began to fracture into smaller, weaker khanates. Kazan, Crimea, Astrakhan, Sibir, each fought for survival, often against each other. The empire that had once terrified the West was now eating itself alive. And Europe, once paralyzed by fear, began to look eastward with hunger. In the 15th century, the rise of the gunpowder age changed everything. The thunder of cannons replaced the whisper of arrows. Fortresses that once fell before Mongol siege engines now stood firm behind iron and stone. The knights who had once been slaughtered at Legnica now rode with firearms at their sides. The Mongols, still loyal to the bow and horse, found themselves trapped in an age that had moved on without them. By the time of Ivan III, known as the Great, Moscow had transformed into the beating heart of a new Russia. He refused to bow, refused to pay tribute, and declared himself the rightful heir of all Rus. The Horde, weakened by civil war and the rise of neighboring powers, could no longer enforce its will. In 1480, on the banks of the Ugra River, the armies of Russia and the Mongols faced each other for the last time. There was no great battle, no thunderous clash. They simply stood, two armies staring across a frozen river, neither willing to cross. Winter came, supplies ran thin, and the Mongols turned away. It was the end of the Tatar yoke. After more than 200 years, the Mongols were gone, but their fall did not end with Russia. In Eastern Europe, the remnants of the Horde, especially the Crimean and Kazan Khanates, continued to raid, pillage, and fight for survival. They became mercenaries in the wars of others, hired blades in conflicts that no longer had meaning. The empire of Genghis had become a ghost, scattered across the steppe. By the dawn of the 16th century, the shadow of Genghis Khan had grown faint. The world that his sons and grandsons had conquered no longer existed. The steppe, once echoing with thunderous hooves, had grown quiet, a silence not of peace, but of extinction. The riders who once carried terror to the gates of Vienna were now fragments of forgotten Khanate, each a pale reflection of an empire that had once stretched from the Pacific to the heart of Europe. In the west, the Golden Horde had splintered into rival states. The Kazan Khanate, the Crimean Khanate, the Astrakhan Khanate, and the Sibir, each claimed the blood of Genghis. Each dreamed of restoring his glory, but their swords were dull, and their enemies had changed. The new rulers of Europe did not fight with bows and horses. They fought with cannons, gunpowder, and walls of iron. The most dangerous of these new enemies rose from the ashes of Mongol domination, Russia. The land once enslaved by the Horde now marched with cold purpose. The princes of Moscow had become Tsar's heirs not to the steppe, but to empire. Ivan IV, the man history would call Ivan the Terrible, looked eastward with a hunger every bit as fierce as Genghis Khan's. The age of Mongol conquest was over. The age of Russian revenge had begun. The Tsardom of Russia turned its eyes toward Kazan, the proud Khanate that had once ruled the Volga. Ivan's armies were vast, tens of thousands of soldiers, cannons, and siege engines. They came not as nomads but as conquerors. For the first time, the sons of Genghis faced an army forged from their own lessons, swift, organized, relentless. The siege of Kazan was brutal. Cannons tore through the walls that had once withstood Mongol arrows. Fires raged. When the city fell, it was not merely a battle lost. It was the death of an era. The banner of the wolf, symbol of the steppe, was replaced by the double-headed eagle of Moscow. From there, the Russians moved south and east, dismantling the remnants of the Mongol world one by one. Astrakhan fell in 1556. The Cyber Khanate, last refuge of Mongol rule in the north, collapsed by the end of the century. The once mighty empire that had ruled half the earth was gone, not in a cataclysm, but in a slow, grinding erasure. But the Mongols' final chapter was not written in Europe. It was written far away, in the heart of Asia, where a last ember still burned. There, in the Central Asian steppes and the mountains of Mongolia, a few surviving tribes still called themselves the children of the sky. They remembered the words of their ancestors, the law of the steppe, the unity of the clans, the reverence for the eternal blue heaven. They watched as Russia expanded, as China grew strong under new dynasties, as Islam and Christianity carved their marks across the world. They were alone now, outnumbered, outgunned, and forgotten. The final act of Mongol history would come not in battle, but in submission. In 1691, the northern Mongol tribes, weakened by endless civil war, bowed to a new rising power, the Qing dynasty of China. It was a bitter surrender. The descendants of Genghis Khan, who had once enslaved emperors, now bent the knee to one. The banner of the great Khan, once raised above Asia and Europe, was folded away. And yet, their spirit did not die. Across centuries, the Mongol legend would haunt the imagination of the world. European historians turned their invasions into warnings. Warriors studied their tactics. Emperors envied their speed and strategy. Even as their empire vanished, the idea of the Mongol remained immortal, the perfect image of conquest, the measure of power itself. But for the people who once carried that name, the glory was long gone. The steppe that had once birthed the greatest cavalry in history was now dotted with Russian fortresses and Chinese garrisons. The ancient roads of empire, the Silk Road itself, lay in ruin, replaced by ships and trade routes that crossed oceans instead of deserts. The world had changed. The horse was no longer king. In Europe, the death of the Mongol Empire opened the door to a new age, the age of empires. Spain, Portugal, England, France, each would build realms across seas, not steppes. They would rule through trade and gunpowder, not the bow and saddle. In a grim twist of fate, they became what the Mongols once were, conquerors of the earth. And yet, even as Europe rose, echoes of the Mongol past remained in the dust of history. The tactics of rapid movement, psychological warfare, and total destruction, all lessons first perfected by the riders of the steppe, became the foundations of modern military power. The shadow of Genghis Khan stretched far beyond his grave. The Mongols had not truly been destroyed by sword or flame. They were undone by something far colder, time. Their empire, born from unity, perished from division. Their strength, born of simplicity, drowned in wealth. Their speed, once unmatched, was crushed beneath the weight of gunpowder and empire. In the end, Europe did not merely defeat the Mongols. It outlasted them, absorbed them, and became what they once represented, a force that reshaped the world in its own image. The sons of the steppe became ghosts. Their horses turned to dust, their empire to legend. But legend is a powerful thing. For every conqueror who came after, from Napoleon to Hitler, the Mongols were the standard, the silent whisper of what absolute power could achieve, and what it would cost. The story of the Mongols is not just about conquest. It is about impermanence, a truth as old as history itself. Nothing built on fear can last forever. And so, when we speak of how Europe finally destroyed the invincible Mongols, what we really mean is this. The wheel of history turned, as it always does. Yesterday's hunter became today's prey. Yesterday's terror became today's tale. The wind that once carried fire and death across continents now carries only whispers of hooves, long silenced, and of an empire swallowed by the very earth it once ruled. Empires do not die in battlefields. They die in memory. If you've traveled this far through the ashes of history, remember to keep exploring the dark corners of the past with us. Subscribe to the channel for more forgotten stories where every empire rises and every legend falls. The Mongols had not truly been destroyed by sword or flame. They were undone by something far colder, time. Their empire, born from unity, perished from division. Their strength, born of simplicity, drowned in wealth. Their speed, once unmatched, was crushed beneath the weight of gunpowder and empire. In the end, Europe did not merely defeat the Mongols, it outlasted them, absorbed them, and became what they once represented, a force that reshaped the world in its own image. The sons of the steppe became ghosts, their horses turned to dust, their empire to legend. But legend is a powerful thing. For every conqueror who came after, from Napoleon to Hitler, the Mongols were the standard, the silent whisper of what absolute power could achieve, and what it would cost. The story of the Mongols is not just about conquest, it is about impermanence, a truth as old as history itself. Nothing built on fear can last forever. And so, when we speak of how Europe finally destroyed the invincible Mongols, what we really mean is this: the wheel of history turned, as it always does. Yesterday's hunter became today's prey. Yesterday's terror became today's tale. The wind that once carried fire and death across continents now carries only whispers of hooves, long silenced, and of an empire swallowed by the very earth it once ruled. Empires do not die in battlefields. They die in memory. If you've traveled this far through the ashes of history, remember to keep exploring the dark corners of the past with us. Subscribe to the channel for more forgotten stories where every empire rises and every legend falls.